Welcome to the very first Brown Bag J School. I'm Roy Maynard with the Associated News Service, and this is the very first seminar that we're holding for journalists throughout the country, members of the Associated News Service. We'd like to take topics that are useful to you as journalists and just explore them. Take a little time, once a month or so at lunch and talk about journalism. So with me today is Faith Harper. Let me tell you a little bit about Faith. Faith was with me at the Tyler Morning Telegraph.
Yes.
We worked together for several years, and she is the best person I know at developing sources. So I wanted to bring her on and just let her talk some and explore her wisdom and her experience on this. So Faith, welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, and it's truly a privilege. And I just want to say that Roy has been a longtime mentor of mine and a longtime friend, and it really means a lot for you to have me on, and for you guys to allow me in your newsroom. So I'm really glad to be here.
So what we'd like to talk about today is sources. I'm going to start with a very brief story from very early in my career. I was in Alvin, Texas, a little tiny town outside of Houston, a small newspaper. And
it's where Nolan Ryan is from.
Where Nolan Ryan is from.
Yes.
One day, the assistant city manager called me and said, "Let's go have lunch out of town." I thought, oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, why do we want to go out of town? Well, I found out later. He told me that the city council was considering selling half of its landfill, brand new landfill, to New Jersey garbage interests. Now, this was before The Sopranos had aired, but we all knew what New Jersey garbage interests meant. It meant the mafia. So that turned into a great story, and eventually about half the city council got voted off in the next election. A whole new city council came in, and now Alvin still owns its landfill. That story got me to my first daily when that story broke. But it all came down to one source who trusted me and came to me with something that he saw that was going on that was illegal. And that helped make my career. But really, it does come down to that, doesn't it, Faith? It comes down to trust.
It does. I would say that trust is the currency of the journalism industry. And that's both with your sources and with the community. You're the safeguards of it, really, and you can't be effective if you can't have trust with those around you.
Absolutely. Tell me something. How do you build trust as a journalist?
It's just like you would build a friendship, right? So it's the simple stuff of do what you say what say do what you intend to do. Mean what you say what you mean. Don't make promises you can't deliver. Like, don't promise a front page centerpiece on a Sunday if you can't deliver that, and part of it too is just kind of knowing where people are coming from. You might have people who've had bad experiences in the past, right? And so you're starting from scratch and just kind of and doing that slowly,
now,
one story at a time.
I want to point out that Faith's experience has largely been at the local level and county level. But this really does apply at all levels of government because, as reporters, a lot of our sources are going to be within government, and we want to build those sources up. But the advice that you're giving, that's going to apply for members of Congress, for people in the administration, people in the agencies, people at state government level. Is that correct?
I would say, yeah. Even with when you just do a man on the street, when you how do you build trust with someone you just met? All of that's very pivotal to being able to tell their story and for them being comfortable to tell you their story. If they're not comfortable, you're not going to get as good of a product in the long run.
So, and that comes down to trust. You said something I want to go back to because I think it's just good advice for life. Under promise and over deliver. Don't make promises you can't keep, and keep the ones that you do make. Is that been something that has benefited your career?
I would say yes. I think that's something actually that you taught me, Roy.
Oh, well, that sounded very close to Roy is right.
Oh my goodness.
What are some basics about trust building?
Okay, so when you work with people in government, you have to understand that you are extra to their job, right? They have deadlines, they have meetings, they have projects to keep on track. All that needs to be meeting budget. So you need to respect people's jobs. If you work if you're working with an agency that has a media policy and they have protocols in place, it sounds pretty simple, but follow them. Someone's not going to talk to you if you get them in trouble with their bosses. That's pretty simple stuff. Learn the culture, right? Some the cultures of organizations vary. You know, some might work really late or get up really early, or there just might be certain topics that they phrase a certain way, or it turns out they need this person's approval to be able to speak to you, those kinds of things. And you also want to find the gatekeepers and the timekeepers. And I
Tell
know
me what a gatekeeper is.
a gatekeeper, girl, you tell me what a gatekeeper is. Why am
So,
I doing all the talking?
the gatekeepers that we're talking about are going to be the people who you need to go through to get the information or the interview that you need. Sometimes that's an executive assistant.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the congressman himself, someone who just really likes to micromanage, might not delegate anything. But find out where that nexus of power is. Where's that bottleneck? Because once you identify that, that's who you friend and that's who you work with.
Well, and they work in offices, right? There's always that one person in an office that keeps everybody on track and keeps everything running. And that's your person. And that's the person that you want to friend.
Find that person.
Right. Who schedules the group meetings? And who makes sure that lunch gets ordered. Those are usually the kind of people who can tell you what's going on in the office, and they also usually have a really good tempo on how the department feels about certain things or like directions that they're going to go in, because they're really keyed in. And another thing I just want to mention too is that sometimes you'll run into people want to be helpful, and sometimes you need to kind of protect sources from themselves. And that means like you could be talking to somebody and you have a question and it's just a little bit out of their expertise area. And they might start saying things like, I think, I believe, I've heard. And when you hear those things, you want to be really cautious because you don't want to get them into trouble if they're like telling you something that is might not be right or it's rumor, right? And you don't want to be in trouble with your readers if you print something and turns out they're just going on the office gossip and not on actually like what is happening in another department or that kind of thing, or they're a person with not the most recent information. So anytime somebody says, I think, I feel, I believe, just kind of be really cautious of that. And you also want to be respectful of people's time, right? Um, they have works, meetings, deadlines, understand the departments, how they work together, that kind of thing. Be prepared, be organized, come to them to make good use of their time so they can get back to their work day. If you end up taking up half their work day and they're perpetually behind on deadlines because they're helping you do your job, it's not going to bode well for you in the long run for them to keep talking to you if you become a burden in their work. And if you are so lucky to get a cell phone number, I know we all are big collectors of cell phone numbers and we hoard them, right? Just be really respectful of that. You're already tying into their work time. You don't want to bleed into their family time as well, unless it's important, right? And pertinent.
One thing that we haven't mentioned yet, let me ask you, Faith, how important is it to meet your sources in person, even in the digital age?
I think I think it really helps. You can ignore an email. You can screen a phone call. A physical person standing in front of you is much harder to ignore. And it's not always possible. We all have time constraints. But where it's possible, I think it's really, really beneficial to put in the time for FaceTime. And it really paints you as a person and not some voice on a phone or a person that they just get emails from all the time. That when you can see their facial expressions and get to know them in that way, it really does go a long way for them seeing you as a person, and you can kind of, and it also helps with native conversations, right? That might lead to more story ideas or just a building of some kind of camaraderie or understanding something more deeply about the organization and how you can best work within it.
Let's see. Okay. Friending the media relations team. How
Yeah,
necessary is this?
okay, so the media relations team are the only people who are required to talk to you, right? So the engineers and all these other people, they're not really required to talk to you. The media relations people, it's their job. And if you have a good media relations team, they act like a concierge service of sorts, and they direct you to the right professional that you need so that you get the right information. They can help you with gathering documents and things like that. And it's also but give them the appropriate amount of time. I mean, we all have there's daily deadlines, and everybody understands that. But if you're working on a long-term project and you need a lot of data, or you're trying to get down to something really specific, you don't want to call them and say, "Hey, I need 15 pages of numbers by 5 o'clock," and they're gonna have to like go really digging for them. Like they have deadlines too. Just be very respectful of their time and how they and that you that we can gather those. And also, if you give them a heads up, they're less likely to make you submit a freedom of information request. And that if they do that, then it's 10 days.
Yeah, let's talk about that real quick. I believe that by the time you get to an FOI request, that represents a kind of a failure. I mean, sometimes you have to submit an FOI request, and I've used them, and you've used them, we've used them throughout our careers. But it represents the fact that I wasn't able to get that information voluntarily. I should have been, it would have been better if my sources were strong enough and my relationship was strong enough that I could go and say, hey, I need these numbers, and they give them to me.
I would agree with that. I would also say that is the case most of the time. But I've also had instances where the media relations people asked me to put in information request while they were already gathering it. And they did that so that they have the paperwork. And at that, I was asking for personnel files. And so they wanted to make sure with their employees that they had that information request so they could say, like, we gave this because we were legally required to, not because we wanted to.
Yeah, we
So
weren't leaking, we were responding to a request.
correct. So there are times, I think for the most part, yes. If you have to submit an FOI request, it could be a delay tactic, or it could be a sign that you don't have trust. But there are instances where it's really just so the entity can prove to their employees that they have to give this information, and they have some paperwork to back that up.
What you should always remember is that when you file an FOI request, you've just turned the relationship adversarial. And one thing that you've said that I like is that your relationship with your sources should not be adversarial until it has to be.
Yeah. I mean, you can get your job done and you can be good at it without being a jerk. But there are times if you catch somebody saying something that's not right, or some process that actually turns out is illegal, or it's just not the best practice in the industry, that you can have those conversations actually without being truly adversarial. Because it's about processes, it's not a personal attack.
Do you think that at times we journalists have earned our reputation for being abrasive?
I think sometimes you need to be abrasive. And abrasive is one way to put it. I would say assertive. Because really, you need to make sure that they know you mean business, but you don't have to be a jerk all the time, only when it matters.
Absolutely.
And
Tell
I
me,
just want to add one little thing. I have some notes here. I want to add one little thing is that if you befriend your media relations people, they can be really helpful in telling you how they keep documents. So in the Freedom of Information Act, at least in Texas, they're not required to create new things for you. They don't have to create data sets. They don't have to do anything like that. They give you it exists, how it exists, and how they keep their records. And your media relations people can really be very helpful in explaining how they keep the records and help you tailor your requests so that you get the information that you need and that you want, and you're not drowning in all this extra paperwork and not getting ultimately the answers you're looking
tell me about talking to people on the street. That's the hardest for me, and I know that you're particularly talented at that.
Yeah, so I think when you talk to the public, It's one thing to maintain your trust with your sources, and you also need to maintain it with the public. And with the public, I always take a softer approach. They they don't have the benefit of knowing how you do your job. They don't understand. The media is like an ambiguous thing to them. It's like it's a concept. And so they don't really have a good idea on what it takes and what it does. So if you're doing something like a man on the street, you want to introduce yourself quickly. Have credentials. Like I am who I say I am. I'm not trying to rob you. You know, if you're coming up to disaster victims, I mean, in journalism, we all talk to people who are having the worst day of their life. Their house just burned down, or they're in a major car wreck,
A hurricane.
or hurricane. Yeah, a natural disaster. And so you really want to be very careful with them. I speak to them in a smooth, even tone. You want to be empathetic, authentic with them, and explain exactly the benefits of talking to you. Like if you're talking to a house fire victim, they just lost everything. People in the community are generally very giving if they know to give. And talking to the newspaper, talking to the media is a good way to get the word out about what their needs are. And so I think I've never really been turned down by somebody, especially like a house fire victim. When you phrase it that way, to say like, "I just want to help," the community is very giving. Um, you
I
know,
want to tell your
I
story.
want to tell your story, and I want to tell it as best I can. You also want to tell them when it's going to be in the paper and talk to them about what they're comfortable with, um, whether or not they want a photo of themselves in the photo or in the newspaper. I always check with them because I just want to be very careful with them, and you want to respect their boundaries. And there's some times where once they get talking, they see you're a person, and you get into a dialogue. They're having a hard day, and they want to tell you more than you probably should know. Like I've been known to remind them, "Hey, I'm the media. Like I'm the newspaper. I don't look like the newspaper, but I am the newspaper. Anything you tell to me, you're telling to everyone." So that's always a good reminder when you're going through there. And you want to get their contact information if you can, if they're willing to, if they can, um, because to follow up with them and check on them later. You're much more likely to get a follow up with them if you're very empathetic and friendly.
How about when you start a new beat or you take a new job? How do you start with building that trust and building those sources?
So it's really just kind of like starting a friendship or starting anything. You need to show one that you're competent, two that you're trustworthy, and those are pretty easy to do. I mean, they sound like simple things, but they can take time, right? So you want to start with stories that they suggest, and stories that maybe are passion projects or things they're working on now. And it sounds simple, but you have to show them that you can print what they said, how they said it, and the details are right. And that sounds really simple, but that's where you start. And then once you've done some of those stories and they start to say, okay, this is going well, and then you can kind of get into some deeper things. What you don't want to do is roll up and say, hey, tell me the deepest, darkest thing that your organization is doing. Hello. I've just met you. Um, I'd also say you want to take yourself seriously. You want to dress the part. You want to speak the part. You want your emails to be formal. You want all of that to be very professional. I think once your sources get further down the line, and you might know about their families and things like that, you can kind of like joke around and be more jovial. But in the beginning, you want to keep it really tight,
Professional.
professional, and then as you grow, and also pretty early on, you want to talk about communication preferences because again, you're extra to their day. So you want to fit into their day the best you can because you're more likely to talk to you or to get back to you. So do they prefer text? Do they prefer email? Are they in meetings every day? Are Wednesdays the day they start at 8 a.m. and they leave at 5 p.m. and they have all this like a block meeting scheduled that they're never available, right? Stuff like that is really pivotal so that you can work within their schedule as best you can. Obviously, there could be emergencies or things like that. But when you talk to them inappropriate, it makes sense for their schedule. You're much more likely to build better rapport. And also, you want to understand kind of where they are in their career. It might be somebody who's on their way out, they're retiring, and they've kind of laissez-faire about everything. Or they could be 6 months into the job, so now both of you are learning together, right? They could be young in their career, like a junior associate or something like that, but kind of like putting some perspective into where they are. And then you want to get FaceTime, back to FaceTime, get some FaceTime whenever you can, and check back in with them until they're used to talking to you, or they won't automatically think of you just because you said hi. You have to check back in with them and say, "Hey, remember me? What have you been up to?" And that's really important, especially in the beginning. Eventually, they'll like come to you when they have stuff, and once they kind of see what you're interested in, or they see how well you've covered their events or their stories, or even some features that might happen within their areas.
Um,
Now, Roy, this is your section.
oh, yes. So we have a great quote from Napoleon. Never ascribe to malice that which is adequately explained by incompetence. And as Faith points out, that was written 300 something years ago and still applies today.
It does still apply today.
Um, as journalists, we tend to be a little cynical, and we tend to look for darker motives. But honestly, I think of government as just an extension of the driver's license office. It may be the part of the government dealing with my passport or the part of the government dealing with my health care, but it's going to function something like the driver's license office. There aren't mean people in the driver's license office. They're just not motivated to move quickly. Let's see. So don't assume that there's a vast conspiracy going on, or that someone's doing something maliciously or out of meanness. Chances are, that it's simply incompetence sometimes, or inexperience.
It
But
could also be just a difference of how they do things.
Sure,
They could. There's a whole lot of we do this because it's how we've always done it, and the reason why we do it this way is lost. There's a lot of that.
right. But what I want us to do is we should assume, and we should do this more in our lives in general. We should assume positive intent more often than we do. Um, Especially if it's a source that we're going to be working with for potentially years. You know, let's get along. And again, that relationship should not be adversarial until it has to be. Um, let's see. You want to make sure before you start making accusations of corrupt or claiming corruption. Let's be sure that it's there. Let's be sure that we understand how that agency works, what their reporting requirements are. Just the basics. And finally, be careful with big data sets. Those are always tricky. You should always find an outside expert to run your data by.
Yes.
Once you've extracted it.
Yeah, I think big data sets can get you in trouble because if you can look at it a lot of ways and get a lot of conclusions, right? So anytime there's big data sets, be real careful. I think if you can take some research methods classes, that's really helpful, and double check it primarily, maybe with an academic or with some kind of professional in the field to make sure that what you think you see is what you see is actually there. And I would also say too, even when you talk to your sources, always come from a place of I want to understand. Please explain to me, because you can't claim corruption if you don't know how it works. And you also, if they're doing something wrong, or if their processes aren't as refined as they should be, if something needs an agent of change, it's always best for them to explain it to you on the front end, and then you verify it on the back end. So I like to say, like, let people lie to you and then verify it. That way you at least have them on the record. You don't want to come in and say, I know how this works and why haven't you done it this way? Let them explain it. And then you can be like, well, actually.
You've just given them enough rope. And
Exactly.
sometimes that's good. Let's talk about anonymous sources. How do you feel about anonymous sources?
I've never used one.
I have only
You know who
used.
has? You.
I have, and I've only used one in my life. And for the record, that anonymous source was a sitting state senator who knew that I would drop his name as soon as someone pushed hard, and he was comfortable with that. But here's some rules for anonymous sources. I don't like them. In general, don't use them. But if you have to, if there's a really good reason, here's some essential rules. Everyone's got an agenda, including your anonymous source.
Yeah.
Know what that is. Figure that out. Someone besides you needs to know who that anonymous source is. That should be your editor or your publisher.
Preferably both.
Preferably both.
Yeah.
Your organization should be well familiar with this person and be able to get a hold of them. When you have a tip that's anonymous, you need at least 2 confirmations. One really good confirmation. If it's an official source, we'd talk, but I really prefer 2 independent confirmations. Like I said, that in my situation, it was someone who knew about the deal that was going down because he was a part of it. And again, make sure that your leadership, your editors and publishers are on board with this, because this can pose a danger to your publication.
It can tank you. Yeah.
It can tank you.
It can tank you. Some people want to use your newspaper or use your platform to push their own agenda, and if they're not tying their name to it, you have to really question why. I'm not saying that anonymous sources can't be useful. You see them much more on the federal level than you do on the local level. On the local level, it's really quite rare. So our friends in DC might run into this quite a bit more than others. And actually, in Roy's case, the story was about a major hospital system being sold to a private firm.
Private equity.
Yeah, private equity firm. And we broke the story, and the public was very upset. And they were calling that, we have this wrong, this is incorrect. We actually got quite a few calls for a correction.
The president of the hospital denied that the sale was going to happen for 2 weeks before it happened.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, that was a very rare instance. And, folks, I would encourage y'all, if you have any questions about it, let's talk about it. You can call me or call Faith. Faith, what do you do when trust is broken?
Well, I guess it depends, right? What to do, it just depends on what it is. Sometimes it's just a difference of a viewpoint. I mean, every year I have the same discussion with city leaders on tax rate increase. So their take is if we keep the tax rate the same, we're not raising taxes. And the newspaper has the viewpoint, if you're paying more and you're getting more money, you've raised taxes. And the city would say, well, we don't control property values. And so that's not us. That's the appraisal district. And so you can see validness on either side. And so every year we would have the same discussion. And every year
we always won.
We would agree to disagree, and there were really no hard feelings. So that's kind of one where it's a difference in viewpoints, or like somebody you're like, well, I wouldn't do it that way, but it's not illegal, something like that. But then you have like a misunderstanding or a simple error. We're all human. You work with humans. You got to give humans grace. Maybe you got a slight number wrong or something like that. You just print a correction, fix it online immediately, print a correction. And if you have other stories, if that fact is going to come up later, then reiterate the correct fact. Like I used to go out of my way if I had a correction, if I made a mistake, if there was an opportunity to repeat in another story the right information, I would take it, just to make sure that we're iterating to the public the correct information, because the incorrect information will go much further. It'll go far before you have a chance to catch it. So any opportunity that you have to bring it back up is good. But then you have some other things, and I talked to some friends of mine who work in government, and they told me some stories. So these are some stories from some friends of mine. But there's also like omitting pertinent information, and so they had a story about the airport. There's some folks who were real mad about the airport, and so the city got them in touch with the airport manager. They got all these data sets of, you know, flight records and stuff like that. And in the end, when they saw the story, the airport manager was there answering all the questions, and the way that the TV station framed it was, we have all of these unanswered questions still left, but they were answered in the data sets that were given to them, and they just opted not to use them. And I mean, I guess it's not technically wrong, because when you have discretion to put whichever facts in the story and to kind of frame it, you have some discretion within that. But it's disingenuous to say we have questions when they've been answered, right? So that one would take a little bit more to come back from. And then you just have like a blatant misquoting. So there was a scenario that I was told about where there was a council member, and they didn't tell me the story. So the council member was talking to a reporter and answered all these questions. And then when the story came out, his quotes were right, but they were attributed to different, like the questions didn't line up with the answers in the final story. And that source was burned. I wouldn't talk to them again. And it's a city council member. It's not like a member of city staff. That person doesn't have to talk to you if they don't want to, or they could just start sending you statements instead of answering your phone calls. So
What happens when a correction isn't enough?
I was going to ask you when you want to burn a source.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's go there. When Tell me about burning a source. What does that mean, and when is it appropriate?
Sorry, I'm thinking of the right words. You don't do that unless you're ready to move up to the next level. If you're ready to get rid of that relationship altogether, it better be a good story, and it better be a good story to move you to the next level. And there are stories like that. I mean, there's some big mistakes that can be made, but you don't want to do that unless you've got to. So,
Revealing a source's name when you've told them you wouldn't. I mean, that's something you just don't do.
no.
But if they're aware that their name might come up, or that somebody may find out that they were the only source of this information, that the only way it could have gotten out, sometimes those things happen. But you're right. I think your quote was the other day, if you're going to burn a source, burn it all the way down.
All the way down.
There's no coming back to that relationship.
And Roy and I actually have a story that we did. The commissioner's court, they had an illegal meeting, and they pushed through this big contract, and it was $10 million a year, and they didn't do it properly. And in investigating that, there was a lot of burn sources. It went to court. The meeting was found to be illegal. Anything that was done within it was voided, and it was a really tough time to be working with those sources, to work with the county while all of that was being litigated, and the county didn't know how to handle it or who should recuse from what. It was quite a mess. It was a big mess.
It was a corrupt county judge who was eventually removed based on our reporting. But yeah, so tell me about tell me your sheriff story.
My sheriff story.
Tell me when a correction isn't enough.
I think this is the whole reason that Roy asked me to come, because I have been, the biggest mistake of my career had to do with math. And it ended up on political flyers that got mailed out with incorrect information. So the story was about the sheriff and the sheriff's budget and the percentage increase that he wanted in his budget. I did math wrong. I added 2 percentages and got 30%. That's not how you do that. So 30% was wrong. It was actually about 4.5%, which is not great. So that was on the front page, above the fold. I was very lucky though, because I was the one, I got a very nice email from a reader first thing in the morning who's clearly better at math than I was. And they called it out. That, like, I think you meant to do this or what have you. And so I immediately went to my editor, and then we immediately put a correction, like fixed it online immediately, and then called the sheriff. That's it. Very apologetic, mortified. And he gave me a lot of grace, and I'm really surprised that he did. His response to me was, "Oh, Faith, I'm on vacation. Let's deal with this when I get back." And I think that was his response because I'd worked with him for years. We've done budget stories for years. I think that even though that mistake was large, he knew I didn't do it on purpose. Like, I wasn't trying to attack him. I wasn't like trying to work with his opponent. He was up for re-election and he had an opponent. So it was extra painful to him that this blunder happened. So we all sat in a nice room with my editor and my publisher and me, because the relationship with your county sheriff is very important. And we need to maintain that, both to me and the newspaper. It's very hard to report on crime if you get blacked out by the sheriff. They're not giving you jail anything, right, if that happens. So we actually worked out kind of a coverage plan of how we could highlight what actually was in his budget and the correct numbers and what that would mean and all of that. So we actually ended up doing some extra coverage to kind of make it up to him. But since he was up for re-election, that bad number got printed on mailers and mailed to thousands of people and attributed to the paper.
Yeah. You said something earlier that I want to go back to. You said that sources also have power. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so journalism is a two-way street, right? So I have tools in my arsenal, and they have tools too. So trust is the currency. If it's broken, the sources have their way of doing things too. So some of the things they might do, they might spend a lot of time with you, but in a bad way. I was told a story by some of my friends about a particular TV reporter that would do some real selective editing of their video interviews, and so the city would just send their own videographer with them every time there was an interview, so they had video evidence to refute if anything got selectively edited. So they might just start following you around and doing all of your stories with you. They may quit answering your phone calls and try to put everything in a hard copy in an email. So they have a hard copy of exactly what they said. And that's fine, but you don't get good quotes in writing. You never get as good of a quote in an email as you will on a phone or face to face. Or worse, they might just say, like, they give a formal statement anytime they need to talk to you. Or I've actually heard that I've heard people do it where a reporter that has been burned, that burned the city, that they would call and say, like, I have this great story idea, and they'd be like, "Oh, great, give me a minute, let me think about that," and then they would then call another news source and repitch that story to somebody else. It's diabolical, but it can happen. Or they could run away from you. You could be in a meeting, like a government meeting, and you're trying to get a quote, and they're like physically running. Um, I was told a story about the media relations team at a city, and there's a reporter that was actually really difficult to work with. And so the media relations team, again, has to talk to her, has to like work with them. But the other employees at the city didn't. And so anytime that reporter needed information, they would run. I was told the finance director, they came in, so it's budget time. The finance director thought that they were going to have to talk to this reporter, and by the time they walked in, his chair was still spinning. He'd run that quickly. So he's going to be really careful, and be cautious too, because you might burn a source and not know it. It's kind of hard to tell that, but not all people can be upfront to say, I didn't really like that coverage, or something of that wasn't quite right. Like, some folks are much more shy about that kind of thing. So you always want to be really cognizant of the work that you're doing and why you're doing it, and keep your reader at the forefront.
Well, we have a few minutes for questions if we want to switch over to question mode.
Roy, I put a question in the chat.
Oh,
Yeah, my question is, what do you think about news articles published without a byline or anonymously? Like they're published by assistant editor or anyway, that sort of thing.
that tends to make me a little nervous. I like to see bylines. I mean, a lot of like your briefs and things like that may not have a byline or just staff report, something like that. But bigger stories, I tend to like to see a byline.
When I was working at the Tyler Morning Telegraph, I would advocate that anything that we got as a press release, because generally if there was a local story that didn't have a byline, it was because it was a rewritten press release. And so during my tenure there, we made sure to make the byline, the city of Tyler from Smith County or whoever sent that in, so that the reader knew that that was not content that was curated by the newsroom. And I guess it does get kind of tricky too, because you could do staff and wire reports, or you could do something that's just a staff report, but that generally just means that a lot of people worked on it. So in those instances, I think it would be appropriate to say staff reports, and then at the bottom do a contributed line at the end of the story to say these reporters worked on this story. That would be that was how I've handled it in the past.
Okay, thanks.
Any further questions?
Hi, this is Lisa Bennett from Montana. I raised my hand, but I'm not sure if you can see that. Is it okay if I ask my question now?
Please.
Please. It's an open roundtable, so.
All right, great. So we are a new publication. We've been very well received so far, but we haven't actually put in to get like press credentials or anything like that at the Capitol. For a new publication, do you have recommendations for what good first steps might be?
Sure. Yeah, I do that every year. Look, there's an office at your Capitol that will handle that. And if you have any trouble finding it, let me know and I'll help you find it. But there will be probably a website, with a Capitol that has all the information that you need. Generally, you'll need. I don't know if they still require it, but they'll want some kind of a letter saying that you work for the publication that you work for. And really, that's easy to come up with. But yeah, if you have any trouble with it, let me know. I'll help.
But congrats on being a new startup. I think it's wonderful to hear about a new newspaper. Like, that fills my heart with joy.
I have a follow-up question actually for you. This is Lisa again from Montana. I guess my question was a little bit more pointed. I know where the office is at the Capitol to do that. My question was, is there a way to get credentials in general? So not just with the Capitol, like is there something a new publication should do?
So that's an excellent question, and we've talked about that here. Press credentials and press cards, they really don't mean anything, but they're useful. They don't mean anything, and I hope y'all all agree with me that as journalists, we shouldn't have more access than the public does. So a press card shouldn't give me special access. Problem is, it actually often does, and it opens doors sometimes.
Well, and if you're talking to the public, it says like, I am a member I'm
Yes.
not trying to scam you. I'm not sure how that works in Montana. I know there's a Texas agency, the Texas Press Association, that does that kind of credentialing, but I'm not sure. I don't have experience on that process.
We haven't always been members of Texas Press Association, and the years that we weren't, we just made them ourselves. So we literally made our press badges on our printers there in the office. So
and printed them.
That's really as complicated as it gets. You just print something up and put it in a badge around your neck.
Well.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes? Hi.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. We were having trouble with our line before. I'm wondering, can you explain more about why you don't use anonymous sources? And whether if you have two anonymous sources saying the same thing and they're reliable sources, that you wouldn't use that.
So I think we've all seen the abuse of anonymous sources, certainly in the legacy media, and the way that there are always leaks coming out of whatever agency, um, you know, anonymous source from whatever department. Uh, I shy away from anonymous sources because of the potential for abuse. But if there's a specific situation, for example, the one that we were telling you about, where the private equity bought into our hospital system, my source on that was just a friend of mine who happened to be at the country club when the college president was talking about it over drinks at the bar. So, he had the information and it was useful information. And I thought, in this situation, it's worth it. So I think in certain situations, it is, as long as you've got the safeguards to ensure that you're not, that there's no question of you abusing it.
Well, and you also just don't want your publication to have egg on their face. But it sounds like you said that there were two separate confirmations of this information.
Well, yeah, let's say you had
Right?
two anonymous sources saying the same thing to, to senior Senate aides, if you're covering the Senate or something like that, are both close to the issue, that, and, is that something that you would use?
I mean, that sounds like it's coming pretty close to the bar. So you got two Senate insiders saying the same thing independently.
Yes, exactly.
I'd probably take that, and then I'd try to find one more person to confirm it, just to make my own tiny little heart feel better. But yeah, I think.
And it sounds like in your case, you're on the right track, right? You've got two is good, three's better. But I would also have a conversation with your leadership, because anonymous sources, I mean, the biggest risk is really to your newspaper overall. So make sure that your managing editor and your publisher, like those folks, given the confirmations that you have, are comfortable with it. I think some of those things, if you've already got two individual confirmations from some people who are high up, it's going to come down to what your leadership is comfortable with. Because if something were to be wrong, they would be beside you trying to mitigate it, as on the newspaper side.
They'd have to help clean up your mess.
If it became a mess, right?
If it became a mess.
Thank you.
We've got time for a couple more questions if anybody has anything.
Justin DeSales of the Dallas Express. I had a quick question about how do you balance sort of a long-term source and then also reporting ethically on something that might harm them in a way?
Tell them about Joel Baker.
Well, how bad is this thing that would harm them? Right? It's all kind of like big questions of how bad is the thing that they've done? Is it impactful to the public? Like, is it just personally embarrassing? Or is it something that will cost the taxpayers money? Or something like that? I think kind of some questions to ask. I don't know your particular situation. But I would kind of think in those terms. I'm kind of on the fence if you should be like, hey, I know, talk to them about it directly, or if there are other people who might know about it and kind of try and see, to see the impact of that situation. Am I making sense? Because if it's just a personal thing, I would stay away from it. But if it's something that's going to hurt the taxpayer, then it would be worth exploring.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Did that answer for you?
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yep.
Okay.
Got time for one more question.
I'll probably squeeze two if we.
We can probably squeeze two in.
Thought I heard somebody, but Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, I just want to take a minute to say it's been an absolute pleasure spending the time with you today and to be in your newsrooms, and it's really, really great. So we've got a couple things for you, everyone who's here. So we've got a PowerPoint presentation that outlines all of the topics that we've talked about, plus memes that we can send to you. We'll also be sending you a survey because this is our first one. So we want to make sure that this was useful to you. If you have any suggestions on other topics that we can cover, if you have any ideas for improvement, that kind of thing, we would love to hear it. And then we'll also have a video link for this discussion that you can share around if you'd like to.
If any of your colleagues couldn't make it, and if you think that this was useful, you can send them the link. But again, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for participating in the inaugural Brown Bag J School.